The train cut through the American countryside with a steady metallic rhythm, carrying hundreds of German prisoners of war deeper into a land they had only heard about through propaganda. Inside the rail cars, the men sat in tense silence, their field-gray uniforms faded by mud, smoke, and long campaigns that had drained both strength and certainty from their faces. Many had fought in France after the Allied landings. Others had retreated through Belgium as armored divisions pushed relentlessly forward. And some had been captured near the Rhine, where the last defensive lines of Germany were beginning to fracture. Just weeks earlier, they had lived with the constant thunder of artillery and the glow of burning towns on the horizon. Now, what unsettled them most was not destruction, but the complete absence of it. Through narrow windows, they searched for signs of war, cratered roads, shattered factories, blackened neighborhoods. Yet the landscape remained calm, almost indifferent to the global conflict. Wide highways stretched across green land. Farmhouses stood upright with fresh paint. Civilian cars traveled freely without fear of strafing aircraft. There were no desperate refugee columns, no emergency barricades, no smoke drifting upward to stain the sky. It felt impossible. For years they had been told that America was soft, divided, weakened by comfort, a nation unprepared for prolonged war. But what they were witnessing suggested something far more dangerous, a country so powerful that the war had barely touched its soil. One young infantryman pressed his forehead against the glass and whispered, "Where is the damage?" No one responded, because no one could find it. And in that quiet realization, a thought began forming, slow, heavy, unavoidable. What if Germany had underestimated an enemy whose strength was beyond anything they had imagined? When the train finally slowed and came to a halt, guards positioned themselves with calm precision. The prisoners stepped down onto the platform, expecting chaos, shouting, perhaps even revenge. Instead, the Americans moved with controlled professionalism. Rifles were carried ready but not threatening. Orders were clear, translated when necessary, and delivered without cruelty. The atmosphere was firm, yet strangely restrained, as if the war, at least in this moment, had been replaced by procedure. The prisoners lined up, bracing themselves for the first true test of captivity. Nazi messaging had been explicit. Surrender meant suffering. Many believed starvation would begin almost immediately. Yet the processing station told a different story. Names were recorded methodically. Identification numbers were assigned. Military doctors walked down the line, inspecting injuries, reopening field dressings that had not been changed in days, sometimes weeks. Infections were cleaned. Bandages were replaced. One medic even paused to carefully splint a fractured wrist that the captured soldier had been forced to ignore during retreat. Several prisoners were handed cigarettes. Others received cups of hot coffee, real coffee, its aroma rising into the cold air like something from another lifetime. The Germans exchanged guarded looks. This had to be temporary, they thought. Perhaps it was staged for compliance. Kindness from the enemy did not fit the world they understood. Soon, trucks arrived to transport them to the main camp. As the convoy rolled forward, the prisoners watched small American towns pass by, and with every mile, their confusion deepened. Storefront windows were full. Gas stations operated normally. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Couples carrying shopping bags, laughing, unconcerned. There were no ration lines stretching around corners, no bomb shelters carved into sidewalks, no sense of a society straining to survive. It felt less like a wartime nation and more like a country moving confidently toward the future. Then the truck slowed near a busy intersection, forced to pause as civilian traffic crossed ahead, and there, Illuminated behind enormous sheets of glass stood a sight that would burn itself permanently into their memory: a supermarket. At first, several prisoners assumed it was some kind of supply depot reserved for the military, but as their eyes adjusted, the scale of it became unmistakable. Long aisles extended beneath bright electric lighting. Shelves were packed from edge to edge with products in colorful packaging. Fresh fruits were stacked in geometric pyramids: oranges, apples, bananas, their colors almost surreal to men accustomed to scarcity. Nearby, cuts of beef and pork rested on beds of crushed ice, replenished faster than customers could take them. There was white bread, soft and abundant, glass bottles of milk, butter wrapped neatly in paper, eggs by the dozen, chocolate bars, coffee tins, canned soups, items so plentiful that the store displayed them outward, inviting anyone to simply walk in and choose. A German sergeant blinked repeatedly, convinced fatigue was distorting his vision. Another prisoner leaned forward and murmured, "This cannot be real. No country at war could afford this." But it was real. Back home, rationing had tightened its grip long before Germany's military situation deteriorated. Coffee had been replaced with bitter substitutes made from roasted barley. Meat grew increasingly rare. Butter nearly vanished from civilian tables. Families queued for hours, often uncertain whether supplies would last until their turn. Letters from home spoke carefully, never openly critical, yet between the lines, soldiers sensed the hunger spreading across the Reich. And now, here was the enemy displaying food in quantities that felt almost careless. One prisoner quietly calculated how many soldiers such abundance could sustain. The answer unsettled him. If civilians could live like this, what must the army possess? The light changed, traffic moved forward, and the trucks rolled forward again, but the silence among the prisoners had deepened. Something fundamental was shifting inside them. The war was no longer an abstract struggle measured in victories and retreats. It was becoming an economic equation, and the numbers suddenly looked catastrophic for Germany. Upon arrival at the camp, another surprise awaited them: dinner. The men filed forward with metal trays, prepared for the thin soups they associated with survival rations. Instead, ladles delivered generous portions of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and fresh bread. Not luxury, but undeniable nourishment. One prisoner stared at his tray for several seconds before speaking under his breath. "Our civilians would consider this a holiday meal." No one laughed. That night, lying on clean bunks beneath sturdy roofs, many of the prisoners remained awake longer than they intended. Beyond the barracks walls, the American heartland slept peacefully. Factories humming in distant cities, rail lines feeding ports, shipyards launching vessels faster than the oceans could claim them. For the first time since donning their uniforms, these soldiers confronted a possibility more frightening than enemy gunfire. Germany might not simply lose this war on the battlefield. It might be outbuilt, outproduced, and outlasted by an industrial force too vast to comprehend. And as that realization settled quietly across the camp, like the falling night, one truth became harder to deny with every passing hour. They had not just been captured by an opposing army, they had been captured by an economy that seemed impossible to defeat. Morning arrived gently over the prison camp, carried in on a cool breeze that moved across the open fields and tapped softly against the wooden barracks. For a few disoriented seconds, several prisoners forgot where they were. There were no distant explosions to mark the dawn, no shouted alerts, no rumble of artillery creeping closer. Only birdsong, steady, calm, uninterrupted. It was a sound many of them had not heard clearly in years. Then memory returned all at once: capture, the ocean crossing, the supermarket, the impossible abundance, and with it came a quiet, unsettling awareness.
The world they had been told about was not the world they were now seeing with their own eyes. A whistle cut through the air, signaling the start of the day. The prisoners formed lines outside, boots crunching lightly against the gravel. Breakfast followed, and once again expectations collided with reality. Eggs, bread, oatmeal, fresh fruit, real coffee, not ersatz, not the bitter substitute they remembered from home, but genuine coffee, dark and aromatic. One prisoner lifted the metal cup slowly, studying the steam as if it were evidence in a trial. "This is what their soldiers drink every morning?" he asked quietly. Another answered without looking up. "If this is what they give prisoners, imagine what the front-line troops receive." That thought lingered. After the meal, work assignments were posted. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to perform non-combat labor, and America, facing a shortage of agricultural workers, relied heavily on POW manpower to keep farms productive. Many Germans initially assumed this meant brutal field conditions under constant guard. Instead, small transport trucks carried groups beyond the fences into wide farming regions, where the land seemed to stretch forever. The first detail arrived at a massive wheat farm just as the rising sun ignited the fields in gold. Waiting near the barns stood machines unlike anything most of the prisoners had encountered before. Enormous combines, tractors with enclosed cabs, mechanical loaders capable of doing in hours what once demanded dozens of laborers. One former mechanic walked slowly around a tractor, running his hand across the steel frame. "With equipment like this," he murmured, "they don't just harvest food, they manufacture it." The American foreman, a middle-aged farmer with dust on his boots, demonstrated the controls with casual confidence. There was no theatrical display. This was simply normal life here. Engines roared to life smoothly. Grain poured into storage trucks. Conveyor systems moved harvests with relentless efficiency. For the German soldiers, it was another fracture in the narrative they had carried across the Atlantic. Back home, agriculture had increasingly depended on forced labor and prisoners as the war consumed able-bodied workers. Fuel shortages often left machinery idle. Transportation bottlenecks delayed deliveries. Yet here, production seemed almost effortless, powered by fuel that flowed, equipment that functioned, and infrastructure that never appeared to falter. During a short midday break, several prisoners sat beneath the thin shade of a tree, watching trucks loaded with grain disappear down a paved road. One finally spoke the thought none of them wanted to voice. If they can feed their civilians like this and supply armies across 2 oceans. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Days turned into weeks, and the shock did not fade. It evolved. Letters were permitted, heavily monitored, but reliable. Some prisoners hesitated before writing home, unsure how to describe what they were witnessing without sounding disloyal. Others chose careful wording. "Do not worry about me. I am healthy. The food is sufficient." After a pause, he added a line he would never have believed months earlier. "You may even find this difficult to accept, but conditions here are orderly." Meanwhile, encounters with American civilians deepened the psychological shift already underway. On one assignment, a group repaired fencing near a roadside while local families drove past in polished cars. A small boy waved enthusiastically from the back seat. Instinctively, one prisoner glanced around, expecting the guards to react, but the Americans barely seemed to notice. To them, this was routine. The war existed, certainly, but it had not hollowed out daily life. Another afternoon, the prisoners watched as crates were unloaded at a nearby general store. The labels caught their attention. Oranges from California, canned salmon from Alaska, sugar from Louisiana. Goods traveled thousands of miles as if distance were irrelevant. A former logistics officer felt a slow chill. Germany fought constantly to secure supply lines across contested territory. Rail yards were bombed, fuel depots destroyed, replacement parts delayed. Yet here was a nation moving resources across an entire continent without interruption. That night in the barracks, conversation grew unusually candid. "We were told America lacked discipline," one soldier said quietly. Another shook his head. "Discipline is not their weakness. It is hidden inside their industry." The realization was not dramatic. It spread gradually, like dawn replacing darkness. These men had been trained to measure strength in divisions and weaponry, but America's true advantage seemed deeper, embedded in factories, farms, railroads, and an economy operating at full throttle. Soon after, a newly arrived batch of prisoners brought fresh stories from the collapsing Western Front. They spoke of endless Allied vehicles stretching beyond the horizon, of skies crowded with aircraft, of artillery supplied so generously that commanders no longer counted shells with the same caution. "They fire until resistance disappears," one newcomer said flatly. Silence followed. For the first time, some prisoners allowed themselves to consider a possibility that once felt unthinkable, that the outcome of the war might be already decided, not by a single battle, but by overwhelming production. Weeks later, another supervised trip into town delivered the moment many would recall for the rest of their lives. The guards halted the group outside a large grocery while paperwork was finalized nearby. Through the wide glass windows, the prisoners once again saw abundance arranged with almost artistic precision. But this time, they noticed something new. Not just the quantity of goods, but the behavior of the shoppers. People were choosing, comparing brands, returning items to shelves simply because they preferred another option. Choice itself had become a symbol of industrial confidence. A German staff sergeant stared at an entire aisle dedicated solely to breakfast cereals, dozens of brightly colored boxes promising energy, health, flavor. "In Germany, we would celebrate just having grain," he whispered. Another prisoner exhaled slowly. "How do you defeat a country that lives like this while at war?" No one answered, because the question no longer sounded rhetorical. As winter approached, the camp prepared for colder nights. Additional blankets were issued. Barracks were reinforced against the wind. Medical inspections continued regularly. Predictability replaced fear. And with predictability came reflection. One evening, a former school teacher who had served as an infantry lieutenant spoke into the dim light, his voice thoughtful rather than bitter. "Perhaps we misunderstood what modern war truly is," he said. "It is not only fought by soldiers, it is fought by factories, by farmers, by workers we never see." Across the room, a younger soldier stared upward at the wooden rafters. "If that is true," he replied quietly, "then we were losing long before we were captured." Outside, beyond the fences, freight trains rolled through the night carrying steel, oil, ammunition, food, the lifeblood of a nation mobilized without being devastated. Their distant thunder sounded almost identical to the train that had first brought these prisoners here, except now the meaning was unmistakable. It was the sound of capacity, of endurance, of a war machine that did not appear to tire. And as sleep gradually overtook the barracks, one final understanding settled into the thoughts of many German prisoners, heavier than defeat, yet strangely clarifying. They had not just encountered an opposing army, they had glimpsed the industrial heart of a superpower. And in that quiet recognition, the war, at least in their minds, no longer felt uncertain.